Hi there. Welcome to this week's episode of Waste 360's Unpacking Recycling with Charlotte. My name is Charlotte Dreisen, and I am really excited to be here today to talk about all things recycling contamination. This is a topic we've touched on in many of our past episodes, but I figured we are overdue to tackle in a dedicated way together and just talk about recycling contamination for a chunk of time, because it is such a ubiquitous and challenging problem for the industry. Whether you're managing a recycling program at the city scale or in your office building or just in your home. I know I am not the only one who is a nudge and compulsively looks at recycling bins to see what's in them, see if there's any contamination present, whether it's in my own household or a friend or family member's or just walking past a recycling bin on the street. I'm sure I'm not alone there, and we're going to talk about the 12 most common pieces of contamination that recycling programs accept, why they're contamination and why they are in their own special ways problematic. We'll also talk about how much contamination we generally see in programs and how we can improve it, what ways are working for different cities to cut down on that recycling contamination. We won't focus so much today on composting contamination, but certainly there is a lot of overlap there, but just forewarning before we dive in. When we talk about recycling contamination, we're generally talking about anything that a recycling program doesn't explicitly say we want. This might be something that is on a list of please don't recycle this, a do not recycle this list, or it might be something that is just omitted from the list of accepted materials. It depends on the program, and certainly it is really hard to call attention to absolutely everything that you can't put into a blue bin and in the recycling program that you are a part of, whether in your house or office or city as a whole. It can be really tough. But contamination generally falls into two different categories. We like to think about contamination that A, harms the end material quality and lowers the quality of the paper or plastic or glass or metal that we're collecting. We also think about contamination as stuff that messes up the recycling process and physically impedes the ability for the recycling system to work as it's designed. Some pieces of contamination might check off both of those boxes. They might be really problematic for the sorting, for transport, for maybe they're a fire risk, and also lower the end quality of material. But often it's just one or the other. We'll talk about examples of both of those. And when we think about how much contamination we generally see in recycling programs, it does vary pretty hugely. As a general rule of thumb, you can probably anticipate that an average recycling program has anywhere from 20 to 40% contamination. One of the trends that we observe across the country and in other countries too internationally is that single-family residential material is typically cleanest. Multifamily residential material is typically the next most clean, a little bit dirtier, a little bit more contaminated on average, and then material from the kind of business sector, commercial sector is typically most contaminated, relatively speaking. And kind of last but not least, public recycling bins that are open to the public in parks or on the street or by the side of the road are typically the most contaminated, all things considered. There's a lot of strategies that folks employ to try and make recycling bins the most accessible or equally accessible as a trash bin. And certainly we know that co-locating both of those can help mitigate recycling contamination, since if one has an item in their hand and it's not recyclable, but the recycling bin is the only one within their eyesight, they are probably going to be putting that item into the recycling bin, without a doubt. It is definitely consumer behavior there, resident behavior there is not a tricky one to figure out. But we know that as a whole, single family, cleanest, then multifamily, then commercial, then public is generally the trend, the pyramid that we see for contamination. In Washington, D.C., for instance, we have a contamination rate of about 11% for our single-family homes. In the multifamily sector, it's about 27%. And for the commercial side, it's even higher than that. So we definitely know that that trend sticks here, holds up here. However, our single-family contamination rate wasn't always so good. Back in 2017, about 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago now, we had a contamination rate of 27% in our single family recycling stream, the exact same rate we have in our multifamily today. And the city really had a laser focus on getting people to recycle right and prevent contamination from entering the stream in the first place. And over the course of those 4 or 5 years, dedicated outreach and about a $2 per household spend, which is kind of the industry recommended average per household for recycling education each year, was able to be achieved for the 100,000 single family households in DC. And overall, now our contamination rate is some of the cleanest among residential programs in the country, largely thanks to funding and support from the recycling partnership. One of the things that has been really exciting to see in tandem as well is that multifamily is starting to follow suit and move in that direction also. But it's really challenging to find funding to provide that same level of outreach and education to a population that's 4 or 5 times greater. So a lot of cities, when they think about recycling education and outreach, tend to start in the single family residential stream, which they often control, not always, that's a bit closer to home before branching out and doing as robust education to the multifamily sector and business sector. One of the other factors that's often cited is that homeowners that are in single family homes or tenants of single family homes often have kind of higher staying power, and that the multifamily sector tends to be a little bit more transient. Certainly that holds up in a lot of different places, but we know there is a real need for recycling education on both of those fronts regardless. When we think about the average contamination rate that we see nationwide in curbside recycling programs, the Recycling Partnership was also responsible in their curbside recycling report for really putting the first national number together. And that was an average contamination rate of about 17% for inbound recycling contamination from curbside programs, which is really immensely helpful for us to just get a handle on about how much we have to deal with and how much we need to improve. One of the other interesting findings from that report is that about 1/3, 35% of communities knew what their inbound contamination rate. Maybe they're like Washington, D.C., where they do sorts once or twice a year with their recycling facility to figure out what that overall contamination rate is and do annual or periodic waste sorts to zero in on a certain stream or certain part of the city. However, 2/3, about 65% of communities didn't know what their inbound contamination rate was. And that really shows just how challenging it is to figure out data about contamination in a lot of places in the US. So that national number can be really helpful for us to lean on if a given recycling program doesn't have the resources and the staff and the bandwidth or the funding to go in and do annual or periodic waste sorts and figure out the contamination rate that they're looking at. But certainly it can be really helpful because we know that one contamination rate is never going to be exactly the same across any geographic area. So while we have an average 11% recycling contamination rate in Washington, D.C. for our single family homes, it's better in some parts of the city, and in other parts of the city it is much, much worse. But that's the average that we know and can lean on. So when we think about recycling contamination and exactly what it is, not only is it important for us to think about that total volume and total tonnage of contamination, but it's also important to think qualitatively about what that contamination is that's being introduced into the stream. And that's important because not only do recycling facilities, of course, want to have the cleanest material that they are able to sell into the commodity market, introduce to the circular economy, and direct back into materials, packaging, and different consumer products, whether fast-moving CPG items or durable goods. But we also, in order to get that material clean, need to have different strategies to remove contamination depending on what that item is. If you toss a pair of shoes into a recycling stream, that's going to be a different strategy to get that pair of sneakers out versus a plastic bag or a block of concrete or a desk chair, all of which definitely you will see on a conveyor belt at a recycling facility. By far, the most common contaminant in most recycling programs are plastic bags or items in plastic bags. The reason why plastic bags are such a problematic contaminant for the recycling stream is that they jam recycling equipment. And specifically, they jam the first piece of equipment that most MRFs and recycling facilities have, which is called a star screen. It's a big tumbler with big hooks, and it kind of goes around in a circle. And the intent is to direct all 2D items and paper up into its own sortation stream, so paper can get into its own separate paper bales. And then all other containers and items kind of continue forward and have their own stages of separation down the line. Plastic bags jam that first piece of recycling equipment, that star screen, and make it really challenging for that paper to be sorted effectively. It's so problematic that in most recycling programs and recycling facilities, the entire facility has to be shut down multiple times a day for workers to go in, climb into the machinery, and use box cutters to cut out plastic film or material in bags that have jammed that equipment. And one of the really, really unfortunate things is that a lot of times women, because they're physically smaller, are asked to go in and cut out those plastic bags and film in facilities since they can fit into the machinery better than your average man might be able to, which lends a whole equity twist onto recycling contamination that we might not always think about. But certainly, regardless of who's climbing into that equipment, it is a really big injury-prone task. So we know it's one of the biggest sources that employees in the recycling industry get injured, and we want to prevent from that angle, first and foremost, in addition to the additional cost and time it adds to the process. Not only is that downtime really challenging for facilities to have to shut down entirely once, twice, 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day, even more in some instances, but we also, when we have more contaminated material, we have to run the whole process at a recycling facility slower. So if you have really clean, maybe 7, 8, 9% contaminated recycling, you might be able to run that twice as fast as really dirty, contaminated recyclables, because the conveyor belt needs to move slower for laborers to pick out those contaminated items and those big bundles of plastic bags or big blocks of concrete or desk chairs or propane tanks, you name it. And when it's cleaner, you can have that be a faster process as a whole, and you don't have to shut down your facility nearly as much. One of the exciting innovations to try and prevent those plastic bags from being just as problematic as they have been in recent history is to install bigger, wider star screens. And when the tumblers are physically wider, bigger diameter and circumference, it's not as likely that a given plastic bag or piece of plastic film will wrap around it in the same way. But if it's a smaller tumbler, smaller diameter, it's easier for a take-up bag to wrap around that, which definitely has been helping to mitigate that recycling contamination. So in tandem with getting less into the system in the first place, it's really exciting to see innovation in the recycling sector for what contamination is introduced, to figure out better ways of having it pulled out and hopefully automatically preventing workers from needing to be as big of a piece of the puzzle. So after plastic bags, which really universally is one of the biggest contaminants, unless you are in one of the very few exceptions to this rule. New York City is one of the big ones, of course, since they don't yet have containerized collection citywide for trash and recycling. They have recycling go into plastic bags intentionally, but it is an exception to the rule. We then have Tanglers. Tanglers is a category of recycling contamination that we talk about because it wraps around star screens and other recycling equipment in much the same way that a plastic bag does. That can be anything like a garden hose, a bike chain, strings of holiday lights. It can be you see, cords for phone chargers and computer chargers and wire hangers can act as a tangler in a lot of systems, for instance. All of those are the same kind of equipment blocking physical barrier to the recycling process as a problematic contaminant. We then have electronics and batteries as one of our most concerning contaminants in the recycling system. We did a whole episode recently on fires in transfer stations and recycling facilities, and this is why. Batteries and electronics, when introduced into the trash and recycling stream, are big fire hazards. Not only does the ambient heat from the environment that it's in can lead to combustion, but of course when they have a catalyst like a battery that's sparking, it can really facilitate that process. But when we think about electronics as a whole, not only are those batteries a big piece of concern, but they're often really complex mixes of plastic and metal that the recycling system, the curbside recycling system, is just not designed to accommodate. So those really have to go to dedicated household hazardous waste programs or electronics recycling programs to be dealt with in a dedicated manner. Propane tanks and fuel, also a huge fire hazard and contaminant in the recycling system. Not only are we talking about those big propane tanks for your grill, but also little itty bitty camping fuel canisters. Those are all contaminants and are not only likely to cause fires in those instances, but they can also lead to equipment damage and worker injury. My very first 60 seconds at a MRF ever back in the day, a propane tank thunked down on the conveyor belt at the recycling facility and bounced off, and really, if the worker who was next to me didn't kind of dive in the other direction, would have hit them, smashed on their foot. Nothing good is going to come of it there, but it's really just not a kind of size and weight of material that the recycling facilities that we have in the US are really designed to accommodate often, but they can be great items when reused and brought back to a location for refill. Something that we definitely don't want in the curbside recycling system, even though it's made of that high value metal that we know is a really great material to introduce into the recycling stream in and of itself, just not in that format and with that item being contained in it. We also have yard waste. Yard waste is a huge contaminant to the recycling stream. And this is something that I don't think I ever would have thought of before spending a lot of mornings traipsing through recycling routes ahead of recycling trucks. You can really not go, especially in the spring and summer, a day without seeing a bin chock full of grass clippings or yard waste or leaves in the fall, or cut flowers or hunks of wood, you name it. Even dirt and stone you'll see in recycling facilities. due to people putting them into their bins or landscaping companies introducing them to the recycling. Definitely all of that yard waste is often really good to compost, but unfortunately nothing that can be recycled in the curbside system. So definitely something to be wary of, especially during that seasonal time. Something like a string of holiday lights, that's a tangler you really need to be on the lookout for in December, January, February, when people are putting those up on trees and around their homes and properties. You probably don't have to be worried about holiday lights so much in the summer. Conversely, you really need to be worried about yard waste contamination during the summer months, spring months, and as well as people, in the fall are raking leaves and cleaning up yard waste at the end of the season. So those are all big items, and definitely have a big seasonal component. Something like paint, big recycling contaminant, doesn't necessarily have that same seasonal cycle necessarily, but a lot of paint can be very hazardous and something that needs to be managed as a household hazardous waste item as a whole. Most communities will accept the paint container if it's totally dry and empty, but if you have, a couple inches left of paint, that is something that cannot be put into their curbside recycling system, really no matter where you are, unfortunately. When it comes to polystyrene, that is another item that's a contaminant in most recycling systems, north of 90% in the US. There are a very small number of programs that do accept it curbside, but polystyrene is a really hard item to transport because it is puffed up with air. So it is a really common item that most communities won't have on their accepted list, that they ask folks to not put into their recycling bin for that reason. Canada relatively is much more active in recycling expanded polystyrene foam as well as rigid polystyrene, which is exciting to see some examples of up there. But definitely in the US, nearly universally, it is a contaminant to most recycling programs. Also because it breaks apart more easily, is something that is pretty hard to make it through the sorting process as a whole. There are densifiers that suck out the air, so it can be kind of a better material weight ratio in terms of the cost and time to haul and transport. So those are really key if and when exploring a expanded polystyrene foam recycling program. But keep it out of your curbside bin almost always in the US. We also then have food and moisture contaminated materials in the recycling stream. Generally speaking, all items have to be clean and dry. In the US, there are some very rare exceptions, typically in very drought-prone communities where they might ask folks, don't go crazy in washing out your plastic containers, your jar of peanut butter due to that concern over water use. But almost always your program is going to ask you to make sure all of your materials are clean. Not only does it lead to higher end quality, this is one of those items that a dirty plastic container isn't going to impede the physical sorting process at a MRF, but it is going to impede the end quality and the revenue you can earn on the recycling market if you have a bale of dirty polypropylene or dirty HDPE. So we want to make sure that's clean and emptied and free of food in some way, shape, or form if you have access to those materials in your recycling program. For something like a soda bottle, you really just need to tip it out and empty the liquid. For something like a peanut butter jar, that's probably going to take some scrubbing and dish soap and hot water and shaking or any combination thereof. We also have paper towels, napkins, tissues that we see in recycling programs a lot. I definitely kind of mentally get that they are paper products. They're made from tree fiber, just like your cereal box or cardboard box or printer paper, but unfortunately they cannot be sorted effectively in the recycling system we have here today. Most of those items are really ripe for compost though, and of course so many of those paper towels, napkins, tissues are food soiled or wet as well. So knowing that we want to be mindful of things being clean and dry, we really don't want to be recycling those materials, both because they can't sort effectively and because of that material quality concern. But excellent for an organic bin if you have access to a composting program that can accept paper products, whether uncoated or coated. Of course, we then have things that are on the macro level side, the really large item side. So something like a golf club, might be something that is made of a recyclable material, but not of a shape or format that can be accommodated in the curbside recycling system. Those, as well as bigger items like furniture or, bulk textiles, are items that we unfortunately can't collect curbside in the recycling system. Really want to keep them out and into dedicated channels for bulk collection, furniture collection, textile collection, but unfortunately can't be sorted and recovered in our curbside recycling system in programs nationwide today. There are some really exciting examples of cities starting to do pickup, bulk, and textile donation and recycling on request, which definitely can help mitigate that friction that many folks have in getting to a transfer station or getting to a recycling drop-off center if they don't have the time or don't have a vehicle to do so, which can be a really big accelerant to diverting those materials successfully. Last but not least, we also have multi-laminate materials. So when we think about the kinds of packaging that we have in our homes, we have a lot of rigid containers, rigid plastic containers, metal, glass, as well as paper products that are all excellent for the recycling system, for the curbside recycling program. But multi-laminate plastic film is a hugely growing category of material that does an excellent job of preserving freshness and protecting items that we have in our cupboards, like coffee, for instance, is almost always in that kind of shiny plastic multi-laminate package, but because it is fused with different layers of plastic and metal and sometimes paper too in a three-fold system, unfortunately the curbside system isn't accommodated to take all of those materials apart and direct them into separate channels for recycling. So multi-laminate plastic film we always want to keep out and put into the trash for now, but exciting innovation along in the US in many programs to try and figure out how we can collect that in a dedicated way, how we can sort it out, as well as reprocess it when we do have a bale of it to work with. So those are the top 12 contaminants that I see in recycling systems and in ours in Washington, D.C. as well, that exist in almost every community in the U.S. There are always exceptions to some rules, but eager to hear from you whether this aligns with the contamination that you see in your recycling programs or in your community or household as well. Feel free, as always, to drop any thoughts, questions, comments directly below this video on Waste 360's website, on YouTube, or over on Twitter at Chardreizen, CHARDREIZEN, or on Instagram at Char Recycles, CHAR Recycles. Thanks so much.